Welcome to AP Environmental Science. In this video lecture, we are going to talk about the carbon cycle. Now, the carbon cycle is one of the major biogeochemical cycles that is talked about in Module 7 of your textbook. Highly encourage you to spend some time with Module 7 to really understand how these cycles work. Now, the carbon cycle is a biogeochemical cycle. Now, bio means living, geo is referring to Earth, chemical is referring to the elements that are being moved around. And these biogeochemical cycles involve the recycling of nutrients throughout the biosphere. Biogeochemical cycles are not involving energy. And we'll talk about this again in this unit in another video. So energy flows through the trophic levels and flows through the food chain and is eventually lost as heat to the environment. Biogeochemical cycles is talking about the chemicals and the atoms and the nutrients that are moving throughout the earth, throughout that biosphere. There are four major biogeochemical cycles that you need to know. Those are the water cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and phosphorus cycle. In this video, we are only looking at the carbon cycle. There are several key processes to the carbon cycle, and you should already know these three. The first one, photosynthesis. The way that it relates to the carbon cycle is the plants are taking carbon from the atmosphere, which is in the form of carbon dioxide, and converting it into sugars. So the C6H12O6 molecule of sugar, of glucose, that is stored in the tissues of those plants and other organisms. Respiration, or cellular respiration, is the process where those plants or animals are breaking down that sugar, and the part that this relates to the carbon cycle is the carbon from the sugar is then released as carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And in the process of cellular respiration, that plant or animal is also able to use some energy. But when we're thinking about carbon cycle, we do not care about the energy. We're particularly just looking at that sugar, the carbon, is being released as carbon dioxide. Then you should also already be a little bit familiar with decomposition. Decomposition is that breaking down of once living organisms by things like microbes and bacteria and certain types of decomposing organisms, decomposers like worms. So they're breaking down those tissues, and remember, all living things are built with this carbon backbone in those macromolecules of carbohydrates and lipids, and your DNA contains a whole bunch of carbon. And that carbon is then released as carbon dioxide as those tissues are being broken down. Some of the processes of the carbon cycle that might be new to you would be things like exchange, sedimentation, and burial. Exchange is this idea that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can very easily dissolve into ocean water, and it's stored as carbon dioxide in that ocean water. And that carbon dioxide in the ocean water can easily be transferred back into the atmosphere. So there's constant exchange from the atmosphere to the ocean. The ocean is actually a really big reservoir or sink that stores a whole bunch of carbon, particularly in the form of carbon dioxide. Sedimentation is the process where that carbon dioxide that's stored in the ocean goes through a process called precipitation. So it precipitates into calcium carbonate. Now, if you remember back to chemistry, if a precipitate is forming, that means it's going from a liquid or a dissolved state into a solid. So that calcium carbonate is a solid or a sediment that is formed on the bottom of the ocean. And when those sediments build up and there's a lot of pressure, that is what forms sedimentary rocks. Now, those sedimentary rocks, they are a very large pool or reservoir of stored carbon, and that is happening in the bottom of the ocean. Now, carbon that's in any form particularly in that sedimentary rock or in partially broken down tissues from plants or animals. If it's buried underground and it's not able to fully decompose and is put in that anaerobic type environment, it can become fossilized, and that fossilized carbon is able to be stored again for a very long period of time. And fossilized carbon is in the form of things like coal, and oil, and natural gas. These are our fossil fuels. Now there are two more processes, and you might be a little bit familiar with these. They are extraction and combustion. Extraction is just humans going in and digging up those fossil fuels and bringing them up to the surface. But then once humans have brought those fossil fuels up to the surface, they do what's called combustion, or the burning of those fossil fuels. And during that process of combustion, that releases a huge amount of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. We can put all of those terms together here in this diagram. You can see on land, there is this cyclical relationship between photosynthesis and respiration, where that carbon dioxide is being produced in respiration and then used in photosynthesis, and it kind of cycles back and forth. We also see that happening in the ocean. When those organisms die, they decompose, and that decomposition also releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. There are some processes, such as volcanic eruptions, that release a bit of carbon dioxide, but honestly, in the scheme of things, it's not a whole heck of a lot of carbon dioxide. There are the processes of exchange that is happening between the atmosphere and the surface of the ocean, where it's going from atmospheric carbon dioxide to dissolved carbon dioxide. That dissolved carbon dioxide can go through precipitation and turn into sediments on the bottom of the ocean through the process of sedimentation. And those sedimentary rocks, along with some of the tissues that have not decomposed of organic living things, can be compressed and turned and buried and turned into fossil fuels. Those fossil fuels could be extracted by humans and burned, and when they're burned, they're releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So I think this diagram does a good job of tying all of these different pieces together. Humans are impacting the carbon cycle in some pretty significant ways. Now, I want you to remember that the process of sedimentation and creating that huge carbon reservoir in terms of fossil fuels takes a very, very, very long time to happen. The process of burning fossil fuels goes very quickly. So what's happening is humans are disrupting this balance in the carbon cycle. And we are adding more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than is being taken out and stored in those reservoirs. So our summary and our key takeaways are listed here. So carbon is cycled through both biotic and abiotic processes. Remember, biotic means living, abiotic means non-living. So the biotic processes would be photosynthesis and cellular respiration. The abiotic processes would be things like exchange between the atmosphere and the ocean, sedimentation, burial, combustion. Those are all processes that do not rely on biotic or living things. Another key takeaway is that a major carbon sink or reservoir would be fossil fuels and the ocean. Students always forget that the ocean is a major reservoir, so I want you to make a note so you don't forget. And also, humans are disrupting this carbon cycle pretty significantly by burning fossil fuels faster than that carbon dioxide can be extracted from the atmosphere and stored in a new reservoir. I know that was a lot of information. I know I went pretty quickly. Feel free to reference the textbook or watch this video again to get some more details. Ask me as many questions as you would like, and I hope that you learned something.